After my last posting, I was asked to talk about the commodity. At first, I thought that the subject didn't fit into the flow of what I was trying to do. But as I thought about it a little bit more, I realized that the suggestion was an excellent one. Interestingly enough, two of the pioneers of economics, Adam Smith and Karl Marx, both begin to build their theories around the commodity. Smith actually begins with the division of labor, but he quickly turns over to analyzing transactions, which govern the exchange of commodities. Smith turns, after a while, back to commodities in discussing the division of labor, with a brief mention that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. What this means is that the market extension, which in Keynes's day meant expanding imperial power, allowed for a more sophisticated type of division of labor. He was especially interested in pursuing this line of thought with the question about the American colonies, which were beginning to separate from Britain. But for the most part, this part of his theory fell in the background, largely, I suspect, because it suggested what economists call economies of scale. Economies of scale mean that production becomes more efficient as the scale increases, and Smith went out of his way to avoid the problem. For example, in his discussion of the pin factory, he neglected the fact that there was a steam-operated pin factory in Britain, and instead explored a primitive form of pin factory. I go into this idea in a lot more detail in the discussion of in my new book called The Invisible Handcuffs: How Market Tyranny Stifles the Economy by Stunting Labor. Economists followed Smith in avoiding increasing returns to scale because the ultimate result of increasing returns to scale will be great monopolies rather than the kind of simple diversified production that Smith and even modern economists like to talk about. Smith then spends most of his time talking about the commodity rather than the division of labor. Abel Lerner, a contemporary of John Maynard Keynes, once said that a transaction is a settled problem, meaning that once you look at commodities from the standpoint of a transaction, there is no place whatsoever for a conflict between various parties. Let me stop for a second and see if this is recorded. Sorry about that. Marx, however, sees the commodity in an entirely different perspective. He begins with a simple transaction, but he emphasizes that the two parties in this transaction have a multitude of differences. Then he explains how the commodity also leads to a series of other commodities, in the sense that you have the input of one good being the output, part of the output for another good. And therefore, when you look at the commodity, in effect, you are positing the existence of a whole network of commodities. You might think of a whole transactional production network, which Marx calls the social division of labor. Unlike Smith's division of labor, which was merely the result of an individual capitalist giving orders to workers on the shop floor, the social division of labor was determined by value relationships, which would express themselves in terms of transactions between various producers and finally the ultimate consumer. But the difference between the transactions and the ultimate value relationships was the fact that workers' labor was being allocated according to these value relationships, even though the participants only saw them dealing with financial transactions. Now, once you get back to the idea of the commodification of labor, Marx treats labor as another commodity, something that seemed very, very novel, and Marx himself was very proud of it. But in fact, the Germans actually had a whole science of labor power, something that was very, very interesting in terms of German thinking, in which scientists would try to make labor more efficient and also to accommodate labor. These two differing objectives, of course, conflicted with each other, but this was part of the German tradition upon which Marx was drawing. When we follow this commodification process further, we see that the English language leads to a delicious irony, and that is the worst thing that can befall a producer is to have the output of that production process to become a commodity. That is, it becomes something where prices start to move toward marginal cost. The implication of this is something that I discussed in earlier presentations. So while the economists are going out of their way to understand the world in terms of commodities, the producers, whom they are trying to understand, are going out of their way to avoid producing commodities. That is, ideally, each producer would like to have his or her products become a unique type of thing that people feel that they must have and cannot be replaced by the consumption of some alternative. So in this sense, the commodification goes right back to what I had been describing in the earlier discussions, in which you have a situation in which prices move to marginal costs, and at the same time, producers will experience widespread bankruptcies. So this, to me, is the great irony of commodities. Irony one is that Marx and Smith start out with the same idea of a commodity. Marx, however, takes it in an entirely different direction. Then the capitalists themselves go to great lengths to avoid the commodification of their products. What this means is that the type of economics that superficially studies commodities, that is, conventional economic thinking, becomes increasingly irrelevant for two reasons. One, it avoids the whole production process. This is the subject of the Invisible Handcuffs book that I mentioned before. And it avoids it by looking at the commodity merely from the perspective of the finished transaction, what Adam Lerner, as I mentioned before, called a solved problem. At the same time, the commodity is something, the status of a commodity is something that capital tries to avoid. So in effect, what they learn, what they teach in business school is to find ways to prevent your operation from becoming something that would be a commodity operation, as expressed by both Adam Smith and his modern contemporaries. So the ironies go further than mere irony then. It suggests the increasing irrelevance of conventional economic thinking, and suggests that we would do well to go back and think about Marx, even if you do not want to accept the entirety of Marx's analysis. You'll find it to be an extremely valuable exercise. So with that, I'll leave you, and thank you for your attention. And I do appreciate the comments that I've been getting on these short and rather unprofessional and even more disorganized presentations. But I've enjoyed them, and I've enjoyed getting the feedback from you. So thank you very much. Goodbye.